I think I'm just going to dive in, and we have time in the uh, plenary afterwards for more Q&A. So I was so excited to be able to share the model of the hero's journey in the context of rehumans and in the context of COVID, right? So when I think about it, this COVID crisis is humanity's hero's journey. And let's look at it with that lens, because I'm sure all of us have heard about Joseph Campbell's great work, but let's put it in this context. I'm going to guide us into thinking that way. So here's the wonderful man. I often think he's sitting on my shoulder somewhere whispering all the time because he's so alive and so needed right now. His wonderful book, The Hero with a Thousand Faces. And I asked the question, why do we need to hear Joseph Campbell's message today? Simply because it's a great map for leaders facing challenge and driving change. And that would be all of us, I would imagine, at this time. That would be all of humanity right now, actually. So this quote from the mother Sri Aurobindo, I'm a follower and practitioner of the integral yoga. That is their path. And I love her quote. She says, "The future is for those who have the soul of a hero." And we may remember that Campbell, when he plotted the hero's journey, he had like 17 steps on the journey. And then Christopher Fogler went and created maybe 12, and realized it's too much for us as leaders to remember. So let's bring it down to something so simple like 4 steps that we cannot forget. So if you look at the 4-stage heroic journey, in a nutshell, it begins with a crisis, right? If you're Frodo in Lord of the Rings, suddenly out of nowhere, you get the ring and you have to run away from your Shire. So you're shaken out of normalcy. If the journey begins with a crisis. And as I'm going to describe this heroic journey, I want you to be checking in with yourself on how this is applying to your life, because we're all the heroes and heroines of our life story. So check in with your own journey right now, and also keep a hat on to understand this as humanity's hero's journey. So here's a crisis. We're shaken out of normalcy. I like to tell my story. When my husband was 40, I was 35. We were living in London, and we were at the height of our corporate careers, and life was wonderful. We had 2 little children, 8 and 11 years old. And then suddenly, out of nowhere, he goes for a routine medical checkup, and he calls me from the hospital, his voice shaking. He says, "You better come here quickly, it's bad news." And when I reached the hospital, I, I, I heard that he has 2 tumors in his colon, and they've diagnosed him with colon cancer. So right there is a crisis. You're shaken out of normalcy, and you're thrown into this trauma, right? So the world above that you see is called the ordinary world, the upper hemisphere, and the world below is the magical world, the extraordinary world. And so here's trauma. You're thrown into the deep end. You're coming to grips with an unfamiliar world. All your strategies that worked in the world above do not work in the world below. And it is a very, very traumatic time. Does this sound familiar to us right now, right? So in our case, we didn't know whether Vijay is going to live or die, and our children are so young. What are we going to do with our life? How is he going to recover? And interestingly, in this time, you also get allies and mentors. Someone shows up, like Gandalf shows up in Frodo's life, and it's Dumbledore for Harry Potter, it's Yoda and Obi-Wan Kenobi for Luke Skywalker. In our case, it was a Jesuit priest, Father Lancy Pereira, who came all the way from India on his way to Germany to say, "Can I come spend time with you and teach you what I know about integrative medicine?" He was my professor from college from many years ago that I had lost touch with. So this is a very beautiful thing, that we never are alone. Somehow there are these mysterious allies, and there is help available. Let us remember that. We never enter a crisis alone. There's help if we know how to find it and accept it. So, and then what is required of us is facing our worst fear, what's called the villain, the shadow, that aspect of ourselves that we have not wanted to encounter up until then. But interestingly, this is the one thing you now have to do. one thing you wanted to avoid is what you now have to face and you have to go through. In our case, the one thing we never wanted was to return to India, because the whole was, we're going to leave India and we're going to make this international lifestyle for ourselves. And then, my husband had to make that hard decision, giving up his expat corporate career. And he says, I had to choose life over lifestyle. And so we returned to India. We had to face that first fear. How are the children going to, learn to live in a very different culture because they had not grown up in India? And once we faced our worst fear and we started Roots and Wings Consulting, we started teaching everything we were learning to others. We started this conscious leadership consultancy. I created an integrative medicine program for cancer, started helping other cancer patients with all that we were learning. I became a yoga teacher, which I did Vipassana. We really embraced all the transformational practices available to us. And then you discover when you can go through your worst fear and you can make that decision you never wanted to make, there is transformation. In the process, you discover your greatness and develop new capacities, and you unlock power you never knew you had. So it's interesting that when you are able to do the one you don't want to do, it unlocks incredible potential. And we wrote our book, My Cancer Is Me. And it was interesting. We have moved to Bangalore, we have retired, and this is how we're going to go into the sunset. Life doesn't end in Act 2. There will always be an Act 3. So Act 2 is this underworld. Act 3 is when you are sent back into the world you once belonged to. And you have to bring what Joseph Campbell calls an elixir, the gift. You have to bring what is it you learned from your death and resurrection journey where you faced your worst fears. You have to bring that gift back to the world and share it with that world, that community, because that is the very healing medicine your community, your tribe, your country, your world needs to heal itself, because it too is stuck in some way. And that is the higher purpose, that you as a portion of that community was sent on this heroic journey of the long dark night of the soul and death and resurrection, and you kind of disappeared to the world above. But in the process, you were finding all this amazing quality that the world above needs. So in a nutshell, leader you are is the person you are. And today when I look back, Vijay is a completely recovered person. He says, cancer saved my life. And he says, let cancer heal you. We run a cancer coaching program now. My book, Shakti Leadership, came out of my journey as a woman through this entire process, as a wife, a mother, as a professional. So much good came out of this incredible, painful time. It was a crisis. And in a nutshell, we must understand from this that the leader you are is the person you are. So as we are going through a leadership journey in the world outside, we cannot make any significant impact unless we have done the hard inner transformation journey as well as a person, as a human being. We cannot put on a mask and show up as these brave leaders if on the inside we haven't actually gone through a transformational personal journey. That's why I like this quote from Walter Robb, the co-CEO of Whole Foods: the leader you are is the person you are. And in a nutshell, this is, I think, beautifully captured the whole experience of a crisis, as explained through Chinese, the Chinese language, that it's made up of these two symbols, right? Wei and Ji. Wei is danger and Ji is opportunity, that the two coexist. Crisis contains both simultaneously. And this quote from Robin Sharma, that behind your greatest fear lies your greatest life. And what doesn't kill you only makes you stronger. So as you're thinking about your hero's journey and the crises you have overcome in the past, let's also understand what we are looking at now with COVID-19, right? The fear of death is very real for all of us. So the question I asked myself, why do we have to wait for a crisis and trauma to somehow go into the person we are meant to be? and to bring our potential? Isn't there a way to make this journey more consciously without having to go through crisis and trauma? Isn't there a better way? So this is what we have proposed in the book. This is our build on Hero's journey and Campbell's. Yes, we can journey consciously, provided we wait for an evolutionary impulse and we anticipate change. So when life becomes a bit too comfortable, when it's feeling a little same old, and you're kind of not growing anymore, that is when your awareness must give you a little warning sign that change is imminent. Anticipate change, await that wave consciousness, life coming at you, anticipate that evolutionary impulse rise through you, and then willingly enter the magical world, willingly allow some kind of a dissolution, some kind of a death to take place. And that means allow the old self to die, release some old ways of being and doing that are outdated and perhaps not needed anymore. Instead of having it forced upon you, willingly surrender it, give it up, let it go. And engage your unrealized potential, that innate power, that potential, that Shakti that's sitting in you, the power of your own consciousness. Engage it. Try on something new for size. Flex your muscles. Put yourself through discomfort willingly by kind of leaning into your growth edge, right? So once you do that, it's evolution. You develop new gifts and capacities willingly, and you evolve. It doesn't end there, because your evolution has to serve resolution of your world in some way. That which has grown you, that new capacity you have found, the new ideas that have come to you as a result, you have to bring resolution to the world with that gift. You have to transform the world. So this is a conscious hero's journey, if you will, that we offer in Shakti leadership. That don't wait for a whack and a crisis. Don't wait for cancer. Don't wait for COVID another time. How can we enter into the next evolutionary stage at the right time in our individual and collective lives, so that we don't have to be forced into evolution? Because the law is evolve or die. Not growing and not evolving is not an option. So let's look at this. Humanity's call to adventure, okay? Think of the COVID-19 pandemic and global lockdown we are facing. How is it a call to adventure? Because that's what it's called. When the crisis comes, it calls it a call to adventure. Don't think of it as something that you're a victim of. Go out there and claim it like a hero. So how is this perhaps a call to adventure? And in that, what do you need to heroically face? It's going to call the hero in us, right? It's going to call out the courage in us. So what do we need individually to heroically face? What leadership capacity is waiting to be awakened in you? And that's why we asked those questions at the start, the survey we briefly took. And how can this leadership capacity that is waiting to be awakened in you, how can that elixir be exactly what your world needs and what the world needs to heal itself and evolve itself to the next level? So that we go on a hero's journey, not just for our own personal growth, but actually end up in service of our collective evolution. That's the role heroes and heroines play. So what's beautiful is that there's always a cast of characters when we are called to adventure, when we're thrown into our growth edge. There are these allies and there are enemies who start showing up. There is this one villain who we have to face down, right? So I love this understanding that neither friend nor foe, all alike, are our teachers. So think about how could, instead of looking at the virus as a villain, as a persecutor, and thinking of ourselves as victims and locked into our homes and kind of not living anymore, really. So beyond a point, you can't let the fear of death stop you from living. And very often, what the hero's journey shows us is the villain, the so called persecutor, is actually a blessing in disguise. He plays the role of helping grow in some way. So it's like if you want to raise your tennis game, you're not going to play with someone who's a lesser player than you. You're going to find someone who's a better player than you, so you can get match fit and you can keep raising your game. So if we were to reframe the villain, the virus, not as the perpetrator and us as the victims, but if we were to flip our image of ourselves and say, how can we create from this situation? How can we reframe the villain into a challenger? So, a challenger is someone who makes you grow. How can this virus be actually an invitation for our growth? And similarly, if there are helpers out there, lots of good available at this time, don't wait to be rescued by someone else out there. Use them as your coaches, but make sure you find your inner power to rise into your creatorship, your creatorhood, and not stay in a victim place where you're seeing the virus as a persecutor. You hope some vaccine will come out and rescue you. How can we flip this? How can we reclaim power from this situation? How can we find some agency available to us? Yes, the vaccine may happen. Yes, we need to figure out how to deal with this virus, but how can we not be in fear? And how can we actually grow from this experience? What this invitation is today. And I like to talk about how to come into your full power and full agency. You need to become a whole person. And we have the archetype of the half male, half female divine in the yogic tradition called the Ardhanarishwar, the half male god. And so we say a conscious leader is whole because in order to come into your full power, you need to become a whole person. You need to have access to both polarities, the yin and the yang, the Shiva, the Shakti, the masculine, the feminine. You only when both come together are you in your full power and capable really transcending a crisis situation. And eventually we get to these four poles that we need to harness and master and integrate. So psychological wholeness is what we jokingly call the holy family reunion, but it's drawing from some very deep psychological frameworks. It's drawing from how we come into our individuated self, our fullness, our uniqueness. In the Eric Berne model of transaction analysis, you have to become your own parent and your own child. And from the Jungian model, you have to have access to your anima, your inner woman, your feminine side, and your animus, your inner man, your masculine side. And in a nutshell, archetype of a whole leader who's in their full power is the wise fool of tough love. This is a very simple and powerful mnemonic to remember that any leadership crisis challenge situation is going to take one of these four power bases to be. There is nothing beyond this at that level. It's called the fourfold self. The wise is your parent self. The fool is your curious, wondering, playful, not take themselves so seriously child self. The tough is the inner masculine that says no, draws those healthy boundaries. And the love is the empathetic, compassionate, vulnerable, inclusive self, the inner feminine. And between these four polarities that are available to us, psyche, there is really no problem out there that cannot be met. So this is the archetype of a whole leader, the wise fool of tough love. And the journey's key takeaways, therefore, are the only way out is through. And by that I mean journey of the wildebeest. You cannot, as I said, the fear of dying cannot stop you from living. So if you remember the documentaries, the beautiful, uh, films that come out of Africa, the journey of the wildebeest, a time comes when in their migration, they have to face this crocodile infested river. And they have to cross to the other side. And they know there are crocodiles in there and some of them are going to have to die. And yet, time comes where they take this collective breath and they enter those waters. And because going back is not an option. You evolve or you die. And so they enter those waters. Some of them live to see another day. Some of them get eaten by the crocodile, but they move through. So the only way out is through. We cannot come from crisis into trauma and then go back and remain in crisis. We have to face that nadir moment and we have to move through. So the only way out is through, and the only way out is in. So to find the courage, to find the capacities, to competencies, abilities to make that hero's journey successfully, we need to go in and we need to find that inner agency and power. And these are the master keys within: cultivating presence, which is a place beyond your ego, where you have nothing to defend, promote, or fear, and you're available to your full self and to the full context from this unattached place and this witnessing place, and where you can respond rather than react. It was the state that Ichiro took us in as we did our centering practice. And when we are present, it's not a dull, inert place. It's a alive place. It's a place full of power. We call that power Shakti, which is the power of presence. It's the power of the universe, the innate power of existence, and it's moving through you. And it's what evolution wants to create. So it moves through you when you are present, and therefore you'll be able to make your heroic journey because it's what evolution wishes to move through you. So the master key to journeying consciously is to cultivate presence and its power, which is Shakti, which is a very different power base from the ego power, which is win-lose power or giving power away. It's a very different kind of power dynamics when we are in ego. But when we are present, we innately naturally do power with and win, 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 win. What's good for all. I like to always bring this back to the idea of gender relations, that it's time to restore balance. If we were to diagnose all the crises of our time, ecological, economic, social, whatever, if you look at it through the Chinese lens of the yin and yang that Sandy has behind him, it's too much yang energy, not enough yin energy. So we need to restore balance. And we need more women who can bring forth that feminine energy into their systems. We need more men who have access to that feminine energy. So overall, the feminine energy in all our systems and subsystems needs to rise to bring the masculine energy into balance. Otherwise, this is like the Baha'i thing that the bird of humanity has to fly on two wings, masculine, male and female. And as Lynn Twist says, this comes from many traditions, that the bird of humanity has been flying on one wing for too long, and therefore it's exhausted. The male masculine wing, the patriarchy, it's going around in circles now. It needs to now extend the female feminine wing, regardless of gender. In all of us, it needs to bring forth empathy and inclusion and collaboration and caring and sharing. Both these wings need to be extended for the bird of humanity to soar. So it's time to become the whole man, the whole woman, the whole person, and the whole leader. And this is my email ID. This is my last slide. You're most welcome to have a note of this and get it for any further questions you may have. Thank you so much.